My name is Anna Grzymala-Busse. I'm the director of the Europe Center, and it's my great pleasure today to introduce Jan Teorell, who is the professor of political science at Stockholm University in Sweden and one of the top scholars of democratization and state building in the world. He's published extensively in both English and in Swedish, and is the author of 3 books, as well as dozens of articles, which focus on both the conceptualization and the theory of state building, democratization, democracy, and party competition. He's also active with the VDEM project, which is an enormous research effort devoted to the measurement of multiple aspects of democratic and institutional development, both historically and in the contemporary era. And this year, Jan was supposed to be at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Science just up the hill from here, but the pandemic made that impossible. So while we can't welcome him in person to Stanford, please join me in welcoming him virtually, as we're delighted to welcome him today as he presents work on democratic governments and the difficulties faced in forming them, a paper entitled Pre-Electoral Commitments and Bargaining Delays in Parliamentary Democracies. Welcome, Jan.
Thank you very much, Anna, for that nice presentation, and thanks everybody for joining us here. I'd just like to start by saying a few words about the background of this paper, or I should actually admit to say paper to be. So this paper is growing out of a book that we wrote for the Swedish Parliament after the election in 2018, which, as I'll tell you about, ended up being a very complicated government formation process. It took 134 years, so a little bit more than 4 months for the government to form. Therefore, they wanted a real serious study of why that was the case and whether they needed to reform the system. So we wrote the book on this in Swedish, me together with 3 other colleagues, Hanna Bäck and Johannes Lindvall at Lund University and Johan Hellström at Umeå University. And now we are revising this into a paper. This is hopefully going to be part of a special issue in West European politics. But we still don't have a paper to share because there has been some additional data collection, and we're still working on that data part. So I'll tell you a little bit more about sort of where we're at the end of the presentation. But this also means that it's a very, very good opportunity for us to collect comments and feedback on this work. So the sort of background to this whole thing is that it's been shown, and we can also show with our data, that it's taking longer and longer to form governments in West European parliamentary democracies. Whereas sort of right after the World War and in the 50s, you know, this government formation process in Western Europe typically took around 25 to 30 days after an election. There was an increase up until the 70s where this sort of leveled off at around 40 days, but now in the last 10 or 20 years, actually, we'll have an increase again. So now the average is up at about 55 days, and this is data up until 2019. And there is also a huge variation across government formation processes in terms of how long it takes. So looking at the figure to the right there, the red bar there is the Swedish case that I'll talk more about. But there has been some really, really long ones. And the most famous one is the Belgian one right after the election in 2010 that took 541 days. But there also has been long ones in the Netherlands after the 2017 election, in Germany after the 2017 elections, where it took more than 200 days. So the question then for this literature has been why is there this variation? Because sometimes it goes really quickly and sometimes it takes so long time. And most of this literature, and it's not a huge literature actually, although it's been going on for some 20 years, has focused on 2 kinds of explanations in terms of preference uncertainty and bargaining complexity. So really briefly, the idea behind preference uncertainty is that if the players here, the parties really don't know each other's positions or where sort of the limits to what they can concede in bargaining are, that will make it take longer to form a government. And the other feature here is basically just about how many players are there and how far apart are they ideologically. So that's this idea about complexity. The empirical focus has sort of been not fully in line with theoretical ideas. However, that mostly people have been looking at whether government formation processes occur following an election or between elections, and it's very, very clear finding there that they take longer time after an election than if a government falls between two elections. And this has been interpreted as consistent with the idea that preference uncertainty is driving this, because most people agree that preference uncertainty is higher after an election. But there has also been empirical focus on party system fragmentation, basically the number of parties and their seat shares, ideological polarization between the parties, and the size of extreme parties. So all these three things tend to increase the amount of time it takes. Although here it's actually theoretically unclear whether that is due to preference uncertainty or bargaining complexity, because these things can actually tap into both those kinds of theoretical notions. There is, however, not only variation across government formation processes, but very clearly across countries. So looking at the graph to the right here, this is the average number of days it has taken to form a government in these countries since World War II. And you can see there that in some countries, such as Netherlands, Austria, and Belgium, it's sort of pretty normal that it takes more than 2 months. In Netherlands, it's almost normal that it takes 3 months. Whereas in other countries, UK, but also Greece and France, these are pretty quick processes. And Sweden has been in that group too, at least up until recently. So the average in Sweden is 22 days. So this cross-country variation, of course, raises the question or makes you think about rules and institutional differences and constitutional sources of variation. And there has been some studies of this too. Most of them has focused on different aspects of investiture rules. So do you need to have a vote in the legislature in order to approve a nominated prime minister or a proposal for a government, for example, and what kind of decision rule is then in play? There is also one study that has shown that semi-presidential systems, which is in this case basically systems that have a directly elected president, and has shown that it takes systematically shorter time for theoretically maybe not that clear reasons to form governments in these kinds of countries, France being one case, for example. So we try to move this literature forward theoretically by theorizing the role of pre-electoral commitments, which in this paper so far is mostly studied through by looking at pre-electoral coalitions. So this is basically when parties before elections say that they in somehow want to cooperate after the election. And this could be very loose signals, basically that they like each other and that they will support each other's programs. Or they could be pretty strong signals, basically being coalitions in the sense that they say that if we win this election, we will actually form a government together. They have, to some extent, been included in this literature, but almost exclusively with a focus on how they should shorten bargaining duration. And if you just think about it, it sounds natural. There's a pre-electoral coalition, and that election coalition has some success at the election. And of course, it doesn't take much time to put together a government program and form a government. But part of that assumption hasn't really been studied. That is the electoral success of these pre-electoral coalitions, because depending on whether they win or lose, they can actually either shorten or maybe lengthen the government formation process. Or maybe there are other contextual factors we need to take into account when we think about whether pre-electoral coalitions should increase or decrease the length of times to form a government. And slightly related to this, there has been some recent theorizing on these kinds of phenomena under the heading of effective polarization. A very a concept very much in vogue right now, but so I don't have to talk too much about it. But basically, this is about not ideological polarization, but polarization that has to do with what parties you want to socialize with, or whether you sort of think you're your kids can get married to people from the other party. So sort of non-ideological sources of polarization, where some have argued that this could in some ways shorten bargaining duration. So there's a distinction in this literature between sort of in-groups and out-groups. And if the in-groups can form the government, this could actually be something that makes it faster to move to form a government. But if someone in the in-group has to cooperate with someone in the out-group, that could actually make things more complicated. But these sort of efforts at theorizing hasn't really been put to the data, put a test with systematic data yet. Jumping to our data, we will mostly here look at some of the, in this version that I'll present you here, some of the sort of well-known factors that has been driving bargaining duration in these systems. So this is data from a data collection project at Umeå University called PAGED, and they look at more than 300 government formation processes in 17 Western European parliamentary democracies since World War II. And as you can see here, consistent with expectations, when government formation processes occur after elections, they take a longer time than when the government falls in between elections and you try to form a new one. The party system, basically the effective number of parties, this is a slightly revised measure of that, but basically it's a fragmentation measure. The more fragmented the party system, the more and the smaller the parties there are, the more complicated it becomes and the longer it takes to form a government. When it comes to seat share of extreme parties, the pattern is not super clear when you look at it this way, but as we will see, it will become clearer in a multivariate setting. But basically, consistent with the literature and previous studies, we also find in our data that when these extreme parties here are of two variants, I should mention. They could be communist parties, basically, or they could be right-wing populist parties. So whether they are the one or the other, mostly in most countries, depends on what time period you're looking at. So sort of to simplify, before the 90s, most of the extreme parties were communist parties, and after 2000, most of the extreme parties are different kinds of right-wing populist parties. So when they get really high seat shares, it becomes more complicated to form a government. And the idea behind that is that they somehow are pariah parties that the other parties don't want to cooperate with, and that makes it more complicated. You can also see here that just looking at ideological polarization, we don't have measures of effective polarization. It's sort of also consistent with the notion that more complexity leads to longer government formation. The institutional rules, there are some surprises, but most are consistent with the previous literature. So semi-presidential systems have slightly shorter bargaining durations. When it comes to positive parliamentarism, which here is sort of defined as having an investiture vote, so the legislator has to take a vote on the proposal either for the prime minister or the government, and a majority. The requirement is a majority to pass. So that's the sort of a definition of positive parliamentarism. Actually, to some extent surprising, that has no effect on bargaining duration. So that's an institutional rule that in itself doesn't seem to be having much role here. Another more detailed rule that by some has been theorized to affect this is the constructive vote of no confidence. So that's basically the German version of a no confidence vote, where you have to have a replacement for, in the German case, the chancellor, so the prime minister generally, in order to vote the incumbent one out. So basically, the constructive vote of no confidence means it's not only a vote of confidence, where you vote to either keep the prime minister or kick him or her out, but it's actually a vote between him and or her and an alternative. As you may expect, this makes it more complicated after an election. And why would that be the case? Basically, because with the constructive vote of no confidence, the prime minister and the government is in a much more secure seat. So basically, the gains of getting into government increases, and this makes it more difficult for some parties to accept some governments, and that makes it longer to form a government with this kind of rule in place. Between elections, basically, there shouldn't be any bargaining duration at all, since this is a vote between two elections. So the yes staple there in the lower right corner should actually, in theory, be 0. I don't remember now why. There is some outlier at making it be 8 days, but basically consistent with what you might expect. It goes faster with this kind of system if you have a government formation process between elections. So we take this to a regression format with a negative binomial regression, not going into technical detail here. You can see some things that I've already shown you in the graphs there. After elections, it goes faster. So if a coefficient is to the right here, it means it takes longer time. If it's to the right, it shortens the time. Most important here for the story that is to come are the two findings in the middle here. So more fragmented party system and the seat share, the larger seat share of extreme parties makes it take longer to form a government. And what we're doing now in this paper is that we're taking these sort of regression results, these empirical patterns across countries and over time to the Swedish case. So we try to predict the number of days it should take to form a government. In the Swedish case, going back to 76, we got a new constitution in 74. That's why we start in 76. And to see whether we can explain particularly this extremely high number of days it took in 2018. And you can see the two models there that I presented here. The model to the left, I didn't mention this. Here we can actually apply measures of the institutional rules. Here we just apply what's called country fixed effects. So basically this regression to the right here only looks at variation within countries over time. And of course, there is no variation in the institutional rules then, so we can't even estimate them. So taking these two models to the Swedish case, you can see that there is an expectation that it should be more complicated to form a government in Sweden. It should take longer time. And this is particularly the case if you look at the model where the line with the tilted squares there, where the institutional rules are also measured. However, none of these models, and particularly not if you take everything that is peculiar about Sweden, and that's the lower line here with the lying or the regular squares. If you take everything that is peculiar about Sweden, Sweden has a very peculiar kind of government formation system. You really can't predict the 134 days. So there is an expected increase here, having to do with the two facts that in Sweden we have more parties now. So in the 80s we had 5 parties, and then we went up to 6, 7 parties, and now with the entry of the Sweden Democrats after 2010 election, we have 8 parties, and the fact that one of them are of this extreme variant, the Sweden Democrats, were usually sort of branded together with the phenomenon of right-wing populism, which is a pretty broad phenomenon in Sweden. Although, of course, there are many both similarities and differences between the Sweden Democrats and many other of these parties. But they are mostly famous for their very, very harsh anti-immigration policies. So with these kind of parties in the parliament, you should expect it to be more complicated to form a government. But still, there is some number of days there, particularly if we take everything that is peculiar about Sweden into account, that are not accounted for by these statistical methods. So what we do in this paper then is to move on to a case study of Sweden and try to see what it is about Sweden in the election of 2018 that was peculiar in relation to both the statistical findings and then the extant literature. In order to see whether there are new things we have to add to the literature on what explains bargaining duration. And I don't want to spend too much time talking about the setting here, but I just have to mention briefly some basic facts about the Swedish case. So as I mentioned, this is a system for forming the government, which is sort of in many ways unique. We have a compulsory vote of confidence after an election. That played a role after 2018 because the government was voted out. But it doesn't really play any role more generally. So the important thing about the Swedish system is that it's the Speaker of the Parliament that nominates the Prime Minister. So we don't have the king, as in Norway and Denmark, where they still have the monarch doing this, or in the UK. But we also don't have a president doing this. We have the Speaker. And then we have an investiture vote, but a very peculiar one. So it's an investiture vote with a negative decision rule. So this is sort of a both positive and negative parliamentarism at the same time, if you like, but most interpret this as negative parliamentarism. So the nominated prime minister is approved if not a majority votes against him or her. And then there is a limit here. So after 4 unsuccessful attempts, there will be a new election. In the election of 2018, we have had at that time had since around 2006 2 main blocks, and then the addition of a new third party. So the incumbent government were the Social Democrats together with the Green Party, and together with the Left Party, whom they collaborated with. They had, as you can see, there are slight majority in terms of seat shares over this right-wing coalition, sort of center-right coalition, with four different center-right parties that had formed, which will become crucial to our story here, a pre-electoral coalition called the Alliance for Sweden. So this was a pre-electoral coalition that was formed already in 2004. And they managed to get into government in 2006. They governed Sweden until 2014, but they were still in play. And then they lost the election to the Social Democrats and the Green Party. But they still had this Alliance for Sweden in play in 2018. And they still promised to form a government if they could win this election. And winning in the Swedish setting here was defined in relative terms. So basically everybody just counted out the Sweden Democrats. So if the red-green bloc would have been the bigger one, they should form the government. And if not, if the Alliance for Sweden were the bigger one, relatively speaking, they should form the government. So just coming from the theories of government formation processes that you saw before, this Alliance for Sweden or this pre-electoral coalition should make it easier to form a government. But in this case, it really did not. It complicated things a lot. And I'll tell you in a moment why that was the case. So really quickly on this one, the timeline here, there were elections on September 9. Sort of the key events here are actually on November 14. There was a first proposal from the Speaker of the Parliament that was rejected by the Parliament. And the fact that's the first time since we adopted this constitution in 1974 that any proposed prime minister was rejected. And this was the right-wing, a proposal for a right-wing coalition between the Moderate Party and the Christian Democrats, headed by the Moderate Party leader, Ulf Kristersson. Then there was another rejection in December of the then Social Democratic leader, still Social Democratic leader, Stefan Löfven. Then 2 parties broke off out of this Alliance for Sweden and started to negotiate with the government parties, and this made the current government form with again Social Democratic Party leader Stefan Löfven and the Green Party. in collaboration with the Liberal Party and the Center Party. So in this case study, we look at two critical junctures. So this is really what we try to explain in the case study. And the critical junctures, as we read this, are these rejected candidates. So when it comes to the first vote that didn't pass, the question is really, why were negotiations between the government parties, that's the Social Democrats and the Green Party, on the one hand, and the Center Party and the Liberal Party that had broken off of this Alliance for Sweden alliance, the Pre-Electoral Coalition, why did they not initiate until December? The Center Party and the Liberal Party, they basically refused to form a government that needed any kind of passive support from the Sweden Democrats. But they knew this all along. They had said this already before the election. They said it on election day. They said it after the election. But still, it took a long time for them to break off of this alliance and start to negotiate with the government. So that's the first question we have to answer here. The second question we have to answer is why it took two negotiation attempts to form a government between or to form a deal, to strike a deal between the Social Democrats, Green Party on the one hand, and the Center Party and the Liberal Party. So these negotiations were attempted already in December, but they broke down. So why was that? Why was that the case? And looking at the first question, this is a picture of the four party leaders, and you can see there they really campaigned together, Alliance for Sweden. And in terms, I mean, as far as pre-electoral coalitions go, we haven't really found evidence of anything that is stronger in terms of pre-electoral coalition than this one. So they, in 3 elections in a row, they actually competed on the same ticket. They had the same program. They really joined forces. Although you couldn't vote for them as an alliance, that was sort of the only thing that didn't make them a full sort of single party. They almost acted as a unitary party, but then they fell apart. So we theorize here that a pre-electoral coalition cannot always make it easier to form a government. If it experiences an election result that exposes some kind of disagreement over government formation, then this can make it even more complicated to form a government. And this, we think, in theoretical terms, we theorize in terms of preference uncertainty, but not the kind of preference uncertainty that has dominated this literature, because most of the previous studies have argued that the preferences uncertainty are about other parties. So if I don't know where the other parties are sort of policy-wise, it will make it more difficult for me to negotiate with them. But here it's actually preference uncertainty concerning your own preferences. And this particularly goes for the two party leaders to the right here, for the center and the Liberal parties. So what risks did they take by breaking off of one coalition and basically entering another one? Although they didn't fully enter it, they passively supported the formation of a government after adopting a policy program, but they actually didn't take part of the government itself. So under certain circumstances that need to be explored further, a pre-electoral coalition can actually make it more difficult to form a government. So why did the negotiations break down? And here's another sort of theoretical point we want to make, just basically basing this on a very, very simple negotiation model, where sort of party A and party B are bargaining about something. And of course, party B wants the solution to be as close to him or her as possible, and party A is the opposite. Typically, these actors have some kind of reservation points. So if a proposal is made that is beyond the reservation point, they will withdraw, and vice versa. So if you know this, if you know the other's reservation points, if you have complete information, it's pretty easy to get along, because you then need to concentrate on finding a solution that is in between these reservation points. If you don't know this, however, this can cause prolonged bargaining or even bargaining failure. Additionally, however, even if you can sort of find this area in between your reservation points where you know that the others where an agreement can be found, you actually also have to believe that even if you know this now, you have to believe it tomorrow too. So this is an agreement that has to be able to be upheld tomorrow. So commitment problems are also a cause of prolonged bargaining failure. And this is something that quite surprisingly to us actually hasn't been introduced much as a theoretical explanation for bargaining failures or bargaining duration in this literature. And I'll just go really quick over this, looking at the center parties, which was the key actor in these agreements. They turned down the December agreement. That was the first negotiation attempt, but they accepted the January agreement, which was the second negotiation attempt with the government. And if you look at the differences between those two agreements, they are actually very, very similar policy-wise. So it's not that the center party actually got that much more policy-wise in the second attempt than they got in the first one. What they got were a number of exact timing of the reforms. So they basically got a schedule, like a timetable for everything they wanted the government to do. So we will have an investigation commission starting in this date. There will be a proposal for legislation on that date, and it will pass on that date. And that was actually what made it possible for the center party to accept this agreement, that they could have overcome these commitment problems. And this is pretty well illustrated when the center party leader, Annie Lööf, sort of tries to explain why she didn't accept the first negotiations. She says that the Social Democrats haven't been able to be sufficiently precise in terms of labor market and housing market reforms. And the wording in that text may look beautiful, but it's vague. So they try to bury things in government commissions and they postpone everything. So that's really what they worked on for the second proposal there, to get a timetable to get away with that vagueness. She says some other interesting things too, but for the interest of time, I'll just move on to my last two slides here. One question that a lot of people has been asking us in Sweden is whether we should now expect this to be the new normal. Should we think that government formation processes that has taken on average 25 days since the World War II now should be sort of take 134 days instead? Well, most of the basically we think not. We think that the speaker of the parliament that you can see on the picture here will look more happy in the future than he did after the election 2018. And the most important reason for that is that we think that the most peculiar feature of that election in 2018 was the pre-electoral coalition, the alliance, who were an alliance in almost every respect, except the sort of the key triggering one in this case, how to deal with the Sweden Democrats. So the fact that they couldn't agree how to form a government if they became dependent on the support from the Sweden Democrats made it really difficult for them to and basically made them split. And now we don't have an alliance with Sweden anymore. That pre-electoral coalition and government coalition has disintegrated. And so we don't think after the election in 2022 next year, for example, it will take that long time. But on the other hand, we should remember the statistical results saying that with more party fragmentation and with an extreme party like the Sweden Democrats having more seat shares, we shouldn't also expect Sweden to go back to the sort of 25 days that were regular before that. So we should probably expect more bargaining failures in Sweden, but not this complicated. So just finally, where we are at with the paper before I end, we are still working on adding margin data on pre-electoral coalitions, and that's why it has been taking so long time to actually get this paper out. Now we have the data, and what it looks like is that Sweden will continue to be an outlier here. So it's not the case that pre-electoral coalitions, even when they don't get sort of their needed majority, it seems as if they are making it easier to form a government rather than this conditional argument that we're making about Sweden. but this is very preliminary, and we're still not sure of it. We also want to make something more of this theoretical contribution we're doing here with the fact that we shouldn't only focus on preference uncertainty and bargaining complexity, which has been the sort of the drivers of this literature, but we should also take commitment potential into account, or commitment problems more generally. So we're hoping to include some measures of that. And finally, this also means that we sort of better need to integrate the Swedish case study into this larger study, because in some ways Sweden could be considered a pathway case. So Sweden sort of illustrates why some of these statistical patterns emerge, such as the share of the seat shares of extreme parties. It's not obvious why that seat share in itself should make it more complicated to form a government, but in Swedish case, it's pretty clear why that is the case. So as they become bigger, they sort of drive in this wedge in previous cooperation patterns, in Swedish case, between the right wing, sort of the center-right parties in the Alliance of Sweden. But in other respects, as I mentioned, when it comes to pre-electoral coalitions, Sweden will remain an outlier. So we need to look more for what sort of particular conditions made this pre-electoral coalition make it so complicated to form a government in Sweden in this particular case. And I hope to be able, if anyone is interested, to send you a paper after the summer. I think I can promise that much. Thank you very much.
Sorry, a year into using this, I still mute myself. Thank you so much, Jan. This is absolutely fantastic. If anybody in the audience has questions, please use the Q&A box. We'd love to hear what you might have to ask Jan. And in the meantime, I'm going to start us off just with a simple question about, so, I think this is absolutely fascinating, this idea that, the real issue here is this inability to make commitments and sort of lack of, one's own confidence about the preferences of one's would-be partners. But does that also translate into divisions within parties? So we have parties now, that basically aren't particularly disciplined, centrist parties that now have multiple factions. So does the logic of pre-electoral coalitions, where you have uncertainty over the preferences of your partners, translate into a logic of sort of large centrist parties that are now increasingly becoming factionalized? Does that basically mean something, so a more global shift towards longer bargaining periods that are based basically on this sort of internal discipline and lack thereof?
That's a super interesting question. Sweden is, however, not a very good setting for studying that or thinking about that, because Swedish parties are still sort of very coherent and not that much at all driven by factions. But there are some dynamics, or there were some dynamics at play, particularly within, as far as you could tell, though, within the Liberal Party and the Center Party. We tried to track down how they came to the decision to sort of basically shift from one alliance to the other. And these processes looked very different. So in the Liberal Party, there were sort of like two factions, actually. One that wanted to stay in the old alliance, and one which was driven by the party leaders that wanted to break out of it and form a new one. It was a long and very complicated decision-making process, and with a slight majority in the end, the party leader got his way. And whether that could be interpreted as some kind of commitment problems, well, that's an interesting question. I actually haven't thought about that. It's pretty clear that it was driven very much by policy, not that much about strategy. So we have actually party positions of these the different candidates, sort of representatives in their legislative caucus. So we can see that the ones who wanted to stick with the old alliance, they are more basically similar to the Sweden Democrats in their policy stances than the ones who wanted to shift the alliance. But whether we can interpret it in these other terms, I really cannot say. So it's a really good question.
It might be something to look at in the large N analysis, right?
Yeah.
Since there are plenty of, and usually we tend to think of factionalized parties as being these large dominant parties, like in Japan or in Italy, the Italian Christian Democrats until 93 or so. But it's increasingly the case that there's there's more sort of incoherence within large centrist parties in developed democracies.
Yeah,
it'd be interesting to see if that sort of lack of coherence then translates into greater difficulty in forming coalitions.
Yeah, true.
And since I'm not I'm going to basically exploit my role as the moderator here. And I also wanted to ask about whether there's a relationship between wasn't in your data, but the relationship between the duration of the bargaining and the durability of the coalition, right? If the process is so fraught, how does that affect?
Yeah, so there is a very general empirical pattern here, and we're far from the first one to discover it or uncover it. So basically, the longer it takes to form a government, typically the shorter its duration. So there's like a negative relationship there, and you can see it most clearly if you think about Greece. Maybe you saw that Greece ended up to the far right there with the shortest government formation processes. And that's basically because the Greek constitution mandates very, very short time periods for this negotiation process. So it's just it's a question of weeks basically until the president gets the role of trying to form a grand coalition, and if that fails, there will be a new election. So Greek government formation processes are sort of mandated to be really short, but they end up forming governments that are then very short-lived. So so I said I got it wrong. So the longer it takes to form a government, the longer it remains. That's the general pattern. Sorry, I think I got it wrong there. So basically, one has to think about the upside, if one may put it that way, of allowing a longer government formation process. So the Netherlands may be a good example of that, where it's just normal that it takes 2 or 3 months, but usually the government also remains in power until the next election because they have these really complicated processes. So there is a relationship, yes, and it's positive.
Although if you include your notions of commitment problems and preference uncertainty, right, that might cast doubt on the duration of the subsequent coalition if those still remain, if they're not fully resolved.
Exactly, but it seems as if they actually do resolve them. I mean, think about Germany. It's the same. It took a long time, and they had a really complicated process between the Social Democrats and the CDU, CSU after the last election, but they're still in power, and they probably will be until the election in the fall.
Right. Of course, then there's Israel, right, where the formateur is the extremist.
Right. They are not part of our data, but they're interesting case, really an interesting case. Yes.
So I'm going to invite the audience to either raise their hand or no. We have a question here. Christoph. Okay. Does the falling apart of the alliance on the right suggest that such alliances are less likely in the future? And that since most governments in Sweden were formed after 19 days, is there any particular reason for that? Is there structural reasons for this?
Yeah. So I can start with the latter one. So the 19 days are sort of if nothing unusual happens after an election, it's just basically maths. So the parliament only summons after 14 days, and then there's on that 14th day they elect a speaker of the parliament. The day after, the speaker nominates a new prime minister, and then that, just by the decision rule, that nomination has to be sort of repeated twice with 2 days delay. So just means that it takes 19 days to form a government if there are sort of no complications and no bargaining basically required, except maybe for the time between the election and when the parliament convenes. When it comes to the alliance in the future, this is very much hotly debated right now, because since this older alliance fell apart, the Sweden Democrats, they are hoping to form a new alliance with the two other remaining parties from that old alliance, the most right-wing ones, the moderate party, that's basically the Swedish version of the Conservatives, and the Christian Democrats. But this is sort of right now a relationship that is not fully sort of mutual, if I may put it that way. So the moderate party and the Christian Democrats, they hope to form a government on with the basis, with the support of the Sweden Democrats, but they really don't want to form a pre-electoral coalition with them. And I think there are several reasons for this, some of which have to do with definitely preference uncertainty and commitment problems. The Sweden Democrats are, you know, a 10-year-old party. They've had to work a lot on professionalizing their organization. There are quite few people at the top of the party that sort of are considered reliable by these other parties to even sort of to even talk with. So there are a lot of reasons why they sort of want to not, you know, at least now, start a more formal coalition with them. But they're also just, you know, electoral reasons in terms of electoral competition. They want to compete with the Sweden Democrats. They pretty much compete over the same voters, and they want to take back, particularly the moderate party that lost like a third of their voters in a 10-year period to the Sweden Democrats. They want to take them back. So and making a, you know, going into a pre-electoral coalition with them would make that more difficult. So in the election of 2022, my answer would be no. I don't think we will see any pre-electoral coalitions at all. Actually, there will be something close to it, mainly in terms of signaling between the moderate party and the Christian Democrats. But one should recall that together, these two parties now poll at around, I don't know, 25-30%. So they are far from being able to, on their own, form a new government. But again, moving into the future, looking at 2026, where things, you know, a lot more water have fallen between below the bridges, as we say in Swedish. This sort of notion may come back, because this alliance for Sweden was extremely successful. As I said, they won 2 elections in a row on the same ticket, basically on the same party program, the same platform, and they were able to coalesce to the extent that they almost operated as a unified party. And they had a lot of sort of reforms that they could enact that are difficult for minority governments to enact. So I think this sort of the dream, or maybe it will be the fantasy of this, the Alliance for Sweden will live on, particularly among the right wing, the center right parties, for some years to come.
It does seem, to echo what Christoph said, there's the model basically both under-predicted 2018 and over-predicted 2014. Right?
Yes. Yes.
And so the question might be, why is that related to?
Yeah. So 14 is actually also an outlier, and that's basically the outgoing party leader of the moderate party. He was our former prime minister, Fredrik Reinfeldt. He resigned on election night, but he more or less made his party just accept the fact that now the other side, that is the center, sort of the red green parties, now they had the relative majority, so we should just pass on the government to them. We should not be in any way talk to the Sweden Democrats. So up until that point, it was a really, really strong policy also in the moderate party and also in the Christian Democratic Party to not have any kind of negotiation or any kind of cooperation or even do anything with the indirect support of the Sweden Democrats. But then both these parties changed party leaders, and a lot of things happened, and just strategically they have reconsidered this position. So yes, 2014 is also an outlier, but in another sense, it was too quick. If when you put it that way.
Are there any other questions? Let's see. Okay. Jan, I wanted to thank you. One of the beautiful things about this presentation is how you sort of married, the very broad theoretical and empirical analysis with the sort of this rich context of the Swedish case. So thank you very much. This was a fantastic presentation. And we'll see everyone next week, hopefully. And in the meantime, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.